April 7th, 1945. Tokyo Bay, Empire of Japan. In the cold, ethereal stillness that precedes the dawn over the Pacific, a new and terrible reality was coalescing for the Japanese home islands. A reality born upon wings of polished aluminum and announced by the magnificent, throaty symphony of 91 Packard-built Merlin engines. The young men of the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups, veterans of brutal aerial combat, yet still boys in many ways, sat strapped tightly into the cockpits of their North American P-51D Mustangs, their breath misting in the frigid high-altitude air. As they approached their designated rendezvous point, the majestic, snow-draped cone of Mount Fuji emerged from the dissipating morning haze, an ancient and serene symbol of the nation they had come to attack, now serving as a starkly ironic navigational beacon for this unprecedented act of modern, industrialized warfare. The mission itself was an audacious, almost arrogant, violation of every established military doctrine. To escort massive formations of B-29 superfortresses on a bombing run deep into the very heart of the enemy's homeland, a mission launched from a tiny, hard-won island base fully 750 miles away. This was a staggering, almost incomprehensible distance that, just 2 short years earlier, the most brilliant military planners had dismissed as a suicidal fantasy, an impossible dream for any single-engine fighter aircraft. As the morning sun finally broke over the horizon, casting long, probing shadows across the pastoral Japanese countryside and revealing a timeless patchwork of emerald rice paddies, clustered farming villages, and heavily defended military installations that had never before been directly threatened by the guns of American fighters, the stage was set for a world-changing drama. At precisely 0700 hours, as more than 100 Japanese interceptor aircraft desperately clawed for altitude to meet the incoming threat, a sight materialized through the morning haze that struck a mortal blow at the very core of Japanese martial pride and long-held strategic certainty. Single-engine American fighters over Tokyo. It was a sight their own commanders had repeatedly and confidently assured them was an absolute impossibility, a psychological shockwave that was immediate, profound, and utterly devastating in its implications. These were not the familiar, short-legged fighters of the U.S. Navy, launched from aircraft carriers that could be hunted, attacked, and sunk by the Imperial Navy. These were land-based U.S. Army Air Forces fighters that had somehow conquered 750 miles of open, unforgiving ocean to appear, as if by some dark magic, with an insolent and terrifying confidence directly over the imperial capital itself. Leading the desperate, scrambling defense were the pilots of Japan's finest and most advanced aircraft, the swift and supremely agile Nakajima Ki-84 codenamed Frank by the Allies. They flew alongside a mixed and increasingly ragged force of older Ki-43 Hayabusas, Ki-44 Shokis, Ki-61 Hents, and the Navy's venerable A6M0s and newer, more powerful N1K-2J Sherdens. The Ki-84 was, on paper and in the right hands, a truly formidable machine, an aircraft capable of outclimbing and outmaneuvering both the P-51 Mustang and the rugged Republic P-47 Thunderbolt under specific conditions of altitude and speed. What was about to unfold high in the skies over Tokyo, however, would not be a simple duel of pilot skill or tactical acumen, but a brutal, one-sided, and bloody lesson in the vast and unbridgeable technological and industrial gulf that separated the two warring nations. The engagement would reveal with chilling, mathematical clarity why the relentless, unceasing power of American industry had produced what countless Allied pilots, with a mixture of awe and affection, would come to call the perfect long-range fighter aircraft. The North American P-51D Mustang had arrived in the Pacific theater already a living legend, its formidable reputation having been forged in the savage, swirling dogfights in the skies over Fortress Europe. There, it had systematically and ruthlessly broken the back of the once invincible Luftwaffe, making the controversial but ultimately war-winning strategy of strategic daylight bombing against the heart of Germany a viable and devastating reality. Initially developed as an export fighter for Great Britain, the aircraft was utterly transformed from a competent but unremarkable medium-altitude performer with its original Allison engine into a world-beating, high-altitude masterpiece when brilliant British engineers ingeniously and audaciously fitted it with their superlative Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. This inspired marriage of a revolutionary American airframe and a peerless British power plant represented one of the most successful and consequential international collaborations in the entire history of aviation. The eventual result of this fusion of genius, the P-51D, provided the U.S. Army Air Forces with a high-performance, high-altitude, long-range weapon of unparalleled capability, an aircraft that could shepherd massive formations of heavy bombers all the way to Berlin and back, sweeping the skies clear of any opposition. And now, incredibly, against all odds and previous conceptions of aerial warfare, it was performing the very same miracle on the grueling 1,500-mile round trip from the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima to the industrial heart of Tokyo. At the very core of this operational miracle was the magnificent Packard V1650-7 engine, a license-built version of the legendary Rolls-Royce Merlin 66. This mechanical jewel, a testament to the power of mass production without sacrificing quality, delivered a staggering 1,695 horsepower at takeoff, a figure that could surge to an emergency rating of 1,720 horsepower with the use of water methanol injection. Crucially, its highly sophisticated two-stage, two-speed mechanical supercharger, a piece of technology the Japanese could not replicate, was the key to its dominance. It allowed the engine to breathe deeply in the thin, cold air of the stratosphere, maintaining its sea-level power output and enabling it to outperform its adversaries in the critical environment above 25,000 feet, where the B-29 superfortresses they were tasked to protect operated. This system worked like a mechanical lung with two gears. At lower altitudes, the supercharger's impeller spun in low gear, providing moderate compression. As the fighter climbed and the air thinned, an automatic barometric control would seamlessly shift the supercharger into high gear, spinning the impeller much faster. The air, now significantly compressed and heated, would then pass through an intercooler, essentially a radiator that cooled the compressed air charge before it entered the engine cylinders. Denser, cooler air meant a more powerful combustion, allowing the Merlin to maintain its performance where other engines began to fail. In this rarefied atmosphere, the Mustang could effortlessly command the sky at speeds approaching 440 miles per hour, an arena where its opponents began to gasp for oxygen and power. It was armed with 6 wing-mounted .50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns, and the mathematics of its firepower were precisely calculated and utterly devastating. With each of the 6 guns firing at a blistering rate of 800 rounds per minute, a Mustang could project a concentrated, buzzsaw-like storm of 4,800 rounds of ammunition per minute, a terrifying 80 rounds of lead and incendiary chemicals every single second. Each 46-gram armor-piercing incendiary round, traveling at a blistering 2,900 feet per second, delivered a tremendous amount of kinetic energy capable of shredding Japanese airframes, which were famously built with little to no armor protection, igniting supposedly self-sealing fuel tanks and obliterating engines and control systems with just a few well-placed hits. By the end of 1944, this proven, combat-tested superiority had led to a strategic decision that saw 14 of the 15 elite fighter groups in the mighty U.S. 8th Air Force in Europe being fully equipped with Mustangs. This massive scale of production and deployment was a direct reflection of American industrial capacity at its absolute zenith, with the sprawling assembly lines at North American Aviation's factories in Inglewood, California, and Dallas, Texas, operating around the clock, 7 days a week, in a relentless hum of activity. At the peak of its production, a brand new, combat-ready Mustang was rolling off the assembly line nearly every single hour. By the war's end, a truly staggering 15,586 P-51s of all variants would be manufactured, with the iconic P 51D model alone accounting for 8,156 of those aircraft, a figure that was greater than Japan's total production of all of its fighter types in the last 2 years of the war combined. The Very Long Range VLR capability that brought these swarms of Mustangs to Tokyo represented a true paradigm shift in fighter operations, an event that fundamentally and permanently altered the cruel calculus of air warfare. Equipped with two specially designed 110-gallon drop tanks, these fighters could routinely undertake grueling 1,500 statute-mile round trips, a feat of endurance and navigation that was equivalent to flying from Los Angeles to Little Rock, Arkansas, entirely over water in a single-engine aircraft, with no diversionary airfields or alternate landing sites save for the cold, unforgiving ocean itself. The key to this incredible and unprecedented achievement was twofold: the magnificent Merlin engine's remarkable fuel efficiency when operated at economical cruise settings, and the P-51's revolutionary and highly advanced laminar flow wing design. Developed by North American's brilliant and visionary chief aerodynamicist, Edgar Schmud, this innovative airfoil was designed to maintain a smooth, attached, and non-turbulent layer of airflow over a much greater percentage of the wing's chord, or surface area. On a conventional wing, the point of maximum thickness is relatively close to the leading edge, and the air flowing over the top becomes turbulent shortly thereafter, creating significant skin friction drag. Schmud's design moved the point of maximum thickness further back, to about 50% of the chord, which encouraged the air to stick to the wing's surface for longer, delaying the transition to turbulent flow. This seemingly minor change dramatically reduced parasitic drag by as much as 35% when compared to conventional wing designs of the era. This reduction in drag translated directly into increased speed, range, and overall performance, allowing the Mustang to slip through the air with unparalleled efficiency. Standing in stark, tragic, and ultimately hopeless contrast was the Nakajima Ki-84 Although it began entering operational service in June of 1944, it was simply too late and produced in far too few numbers to have any meaningful impact on the war's now inevitable outcome. Named Gale by the Japanese and officially designated Frank by the Allies, this fighter was the product of a desperate, last-ditch effort by Japanese engineers to counter the ever-escalating technological might of the Allies with the rapidly dwindling resources of a beleaguered and blockaded empire. While it is generally and correctly considered to be the best all-around Japanese fighter to see widespread service during the conflict, the term widespread was entirely relative. What Japan considered to be mass production, the United States would have classified as a small, experimental prototype run. The aircraft could boast an impressive top speed and superb maneuverability, and its intended armament of up to two heavy 30mm Ho, 155 cannons, and two 20mm Ho, 5 cannons gave it formidable theoretical hitting power. On paper, it was a worthy and even superior adversary in some respects. The grim reality of late-war Japan, however, painted a far more complex and desperate story of plummeting quality, systemic industrial failure, and frantic improvisation. The Ki-84's powerful and advanced Nakajima Hamar 18-cylinder radial engine, a complex and sophisticated piece of machinery with fuel injection and a single-stage 2-speed supercharger, was theoretically capable of producing an impressive 2,000 horsepower. However, in the field, it was notoriously temperamental and plagued by chronic, debilitating unreliability, a problem that grew exponentially worse as Japan's industrial base crumbled under the relentless and systematic B-29 raids. The engine required extremely precise manufacturing tolerances and high-quality specialty alloys that Japanese factories, starved of essential resources and under constant, round-the-clock bombardment, could no longer hope to provide. The shockingly poor quality heat treatment of late-war Japanese steel, which was often laden with impurities that made proper hardening impossible, meant that critical components like landing gear struts were notoriously weak. As a result, many yachts suffered catastrophic and often fatal strut collapses on landing, writing off irreplaceable, frontline aircraft, and killing the very pilots that Japan had spent months of scarce resources training. This glaring disparity in production quality was a microcosm of the broader industrial crisis facing an empire that had gambled its entire existence on a short, decisive war and had lost that gamble completely. While American factories, benefiting from secure supply lines and a vast mobilized workforce, maintained and even improved upon their consistent quality standards despite astronomical production volumes, Japanese manufacturing was in a state of precipitous and irreversible decline. This progressive and systemic deterioration in quality control meant that Japanese pilots often climbed into their cockpits with absolutely no certainty of how their individual aircraft would perform on any given day, whether the brakes would fail on landing, whether the engine would hold together under the strain of high power settings in combat, or whether it would even possess the power to climb high enough to intercept the B-29s, which cruised serenely and untouchably at 30,000 feet. By 1945, Japan had managed to produce only 3,514 Ki-84s in total, and a significant portion of these were permanently grounded due to a crippling lack of spare parts, fuel, or qualified pilots to fly them. Of those that were officially deemed operational, perhaps only half could be considered truly combat-ready at any given time. The fuel situation alone was enough to expose the strategic catastrophe that was confronting Japan. While American pilots flew on an endless supply of high-grade 100-octane aviation gasoline, shipped from massive refineries in Texas and California, Japanese pilots were forced to make do with domestically produced fuel that often tested at a poor 87-octane or lower, sometimes dipping to an abysmal 80-octane. This poor quality, low-performance fuel robbed their engines of vital horsepower and caused destructive pre-ignition that could shatter pistons and warp valves in seconds. In a display of utter and pathetic desperation, some frontline units attempted to supplement their meager and dwindling fuel supplies with crude pine root oil extracted from tree stumps, potent alcohol distilled from sweet potatoes, and even the leftover byproduct from the production of sake. These desperate measures further degraded engine performance, fouled spark plugs, and dramatically increased the likelihood of catastrophic in-flight engine failure. Pilots grimly reported engines that would barely start, ran rough and vibrated violently at all power settings, and often failed completely and catastrophically in the middle of a dogfight. On that historic morning of April 7th, as the first rays of the rising sun glinted off the polished aluminum fuselages of the approaching American Armada, the abstract realities of industrial disparity were about to manifest as a terrifying and violent spectacle. The 91 Mustangs of the 7 Fighter Command meticulously formed up with their colossal charges. 103 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses of the 73rd Bombardment Wing, each a flying fortress in its own right, laden with a deadly cargo of incendiary bombs specifically designed to ignite the predominantly wooden cities of Japan. The sheer scale of the formation was a sight to behold, a breathtaking and intimidating display of air power. Captain Art Bridge, a flight leader in the 45th Fighter Squadron, would later recall the moment with a clarity undimmed by the passage of time. It was a real spectacle, something you never forget. The 29s were just finishing their assembly in a grand, slow-moving circle as we arrived. The sun glinted off their bare, aluminum skin, and they looked like a school of giant silver fish, almost serene, swimming through the endless blue of the sky. This seemingly effortless rendezvous, a pinpoint meeting of over 200 aircraft hundreds of miles from their respective bases, was in itself a profound triumph of navigation, meticulous planning, and technological superiority. The P-51 pilots had traversed 750 miles of featureless, hypnotic open ocean, a daunting task in a single-engine aircraft, navigating primarily by the rudimentary science of dead reckoning, supplemented by basic radio compasses. They timed their arrival to match the bomber's intricate assembly schedule with a precision of mere minutes, a feat that would have been utterly impossible without the reliable instruments, detailed meteorological data, and intensive training that were the hallmarks of the American air effort. As they had climbed gradually from the humid, salt-laden air at sea level to the thin, frigid atmosphere at 25,000 feet, their Packard Merlin engines had performed flawlessly. The automatic systems had constantly adjusted the fuel-air mixture for optimal efficiency and power, while their revolutionary two-stage superchargers had seamlessly and imperceptibly transitioned from the low blower gear to the high blower setting to maintain the crucial horsepower needed to operate at such extreme altitudes. As the massive formation finally crossed the coastline of the main Japanese island of Honshu, a silent, deadly ballet began. The P-51 pilots toggled the switches on their control panels, releasing their now empty 110-gallon auxiliary wing tanks. The gleaming silver drop tanks tumbled end over end, glinting in the morning sun like metallic rain before plummeting towards the earth below. Some exploded in brilliant flashes of residual fuel vapor as they impacted the ground, while others bounced harmlessly across the emerald green of the rice paddies. This shedding of weight was the signal that the transit was over and the battle was about to begin. Almost immediately, the American pilots began to spot the first signs of organized resistance. The dark specks of approaching interceptors, climbing desperately to meet them. From multiple airfields surrounding the vast Tokyo metropolitan area, a force of more than 100 Japanese aircraft was scrambling into the sky. For the Japanese pilots, climbing into their varied assortment of fighters, a mixed force of the new Ki-84s, older but still nimble Ki-43s and Ki-44s, the inline-engine Ki-61s, and a smattering of Navy fighters, including the iconic Zero and the formidable new N-1K-2 J. Denkai. The first visual contact with the enemy formation delivered a profound and disorienting shock. Their intelligence had predicted bombers, perhaps even a raid by carrier-based aircraft. But the sight that greeted them was something else entirely, something their commanders had assured them was a logistical impossibility. As Flight Sergeant Totaro Shimizu, strapped into the cockpit of his Ki-84 with the 56 Sentai, later recalled with chilling clarity, when we were scrambled, the controllers told us enemy fighters were approaching Tokyo. We thought it must be a mistake. Perhaps they meant enemy bombers. When I finally saw the Mustangs with my own eyes, so many of them, so high and confident I thought I was dreaming. It was impossible. Our highest commanders had personally assured us that no land-based American fighter could ever reach Japan from their distant island bases. Yet there they were, dozens and dozens of them, flying with a casual arrogance, as if they owned our sacred sky. In that single heart-stopping moment, I knew with a certainty that went beyond logic that the war was truly lost. This sense of disbelief quickly gave way to the brutal reality of combat. Major James B. Tapp, who would earn the Distinguished Service Cross for his actions on this day and cement his status as an ace with 8 confirmed victories, was one of the first Mustang pilots to tear into a startled Japanese formation. His after-action report, written just hours after the mission with the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, described the initial engagement with a cold, clinical precision that belied the life-and-death chaos of the moment. They came at us in the traditional 3-plane Shotai formation, but their coordination was noticeably poor. The flight leader would commit to a head-on or high-side attack, but his wingmen would often fail to follow through, breaking away early. They seemed hesitant, perhaps conserving their severely rationed fuel or ammunition, or more likely, they were simply inexperienced. We utilized our superior energy and dove through their formations with at least a 100 miles per hour speed advantage, fired quick deflection bursts at multiple targets, and then executed a zoom climb back to our original altitude before they could effectively react or bring their guns to bear. This observed breakdown in Japanese tactical coordination was a direct and tragic reflection of a crisis in pilot training that had reached catastrophic proportions. By the spring of 1945, the vast majority of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy's experienced, battle-hardened pilots were dead. They had been killed over the steaming jungles of the Solomons and New Guinea, shot down during the great carrier battles of the mid-war period, or annihilated in the infamous Marianas Turkey Shoot of 1944. Their replacements were tragically undertrained, young men and boys who were being rushed into the cockpit with as little as 50 hours of total flight training before being thrown into the most demanding and unforgiving form of combat imaginable. This stood in stark, almost criminal contrast to the 600-plus hours of comprehensive instruction that their American counterparts received before even being deployed to a combat theater. When the smoke finally cleared and the victorious Mustangs rendezvoused with the now bombless B-29s to escort them back to their Iwo Jima base, the butcher's bill for the day's engagement was starkly one-sided. The pilots of 7 Fighter Command, who called themselves the Sunsetters, were officially credited with 26 Japanese planes definitively destroyed, 1 probable, and 5 damaged, all for the astonishingly low cost of 2 P-51s and 1 pilot. This stunning 13-to-1 kill ratio, achieved on their very first VLR mission over the enemy's capital, was a grim portent of things to come. This ratio would only improve, becoming even more lopsided as the American pilots gained more experience over the skies of Japan and as the quality of Japanese pilotage and equipment continued its precipitous decline. Within a few short weeks, kill ratios of 20-to-1 or even 30-to-1 would become grimly commonplace, a stark and brutal testament not just to American technological superiority, but to the sheer, abject desperation of the Japanese position. The critical performance differential between the 2 premier aircraft became starkly and undeniably apparent in the vertical dimension, the realm where high-altitude air combat was increasingly fought and decided. The P-51D's superiority was most pronounced and absolute above 20,000 feet, the very altitude where most bomber interceptions took place. At these heights, the Merlin engine's sophisticated 2-stage supercharger, with its crucial intercooler, maintained something close to its sea-level power output, allowing the Mustang to maneuver with crisp authority. In stark contrast, the Japanese engines, including the vaunted Hummer and the Ki-84, struggled desperately in the thin air. Their simpler single-stage superchargers, lacking both an intercooler and a second stage of compression, caused the engine's available horsepower to drop off dramatically above 20,000 feet. This robbed the Japanese fighters of their speed advantage and crippled their climb rate precisely where it was needed most. At 30,000 feet, a standard Ki-84 could barely maintain 350 miles per hour in level flight, while a P-51D at the same altitude could still achieve a blistering 420 miles per hour, a speed advantage that was utterly decisive and strategically insurmountable. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen of the 78 Fighter Squadron, a pilot who would have the historic distinction of flying the very last combat mission of the entire war on August 14th, 1945, August 15th in Japan, described a typical high-altitude engagement with vivid, chilling detail. We'd spot them climbing up to meet us from our perch 5,000 feet above them, leaving dark, oily exhaust trails as they firewalled their throttles. You could almost feel the strain on their machines. But by the time they reached 25,000 feet, they were wallowing like fish out of water. Their engines were smoking, probably running too rich because their superchargers just couldn't provide enough air for proper combustion. We'd execute a coordinated diving pass through their formation with our 6.50s blazing, the tracers looking like laser beams in the thin air, and they simply couldn't match our speed in the dive or, crucially, our subsequent zoom climb afterward. Our Merlin would just sing as we pulled up, the G-forces crushing us into our seats, while their radials would cough and sputter, visibly struggling to maintain power in the thin air. Furthermore, the P-51D, with its incredibly strong and well-engineered airframe and superb aerodynamics, could dive at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour while maintaining full and responsive control authority, its laminar flow wings remaining effective even as they approached the transonic regime. In contrast, many Japanese fighters, including the Ki-84, experienced dangerous control surface blanking or even catastrophic structural failure at speeds above 400 miles per hour in a steep dive. Their control surfaces would become ineffective, or in some documented cases, their wings would simply tear off from the sheer aerodynamic stress. The devastating contrast in pilot quality, a direct consequence of two nations at opposite ends of the attrition curve, grew more pronounced and more tragic with each passing day of the spring and summer of 1945. American pilots arriving at the desolate, volcanic airfields of Iwo Jima were the meticulously crafted products of a vast, mature, and incredibly well-resourced training pipeline. A typical replacement pilot for the 7 Fighter Command would have between 400 and 600 hours of total flight time logged before he ever saw the shores of Japan. This included over 100 hours in the P-51 itself, allowing him to become intimately familiar with every nuance of his complex machine. His training regimen was exhaustive and comprehensive, encompassing dozens of hours of aerial gunnery practice against towed targets, extensive combat simulation against experienced instructors, many of whom were combat veterans themselves, flying captured enemy aircraft or accurate American equivalents, and rigorous instruction in instrument navigation for all-weather flying. They had practiced complex formation flying until it became second nature, a ballet of precise, coordinated movement. They had mastered the science of deflection shooting, learning to lead a fast-moving target in three-dimensional space until it became an instinctive, almost subconscious act. Their tactical education was based on 3 hard years of accumulated air warfare experience from every theater of the war, a brutal but effective curriculum written in the blood of those who had come before them. In stark, almost unbelievable contrast, their Japanese counterparts in 1945 were often little more than boys, some still in their teens, thrust into the cockpit of Japan's most advanced fighters with catastrophically inadequate preparation. Many had less than 100 hours of total flight time, and some, in the final desperate weeks, as few as 30. Their gunnery practice, if they received any at all, was minimal due to crippling ammunition shortages. They had virtually no instrument training, a fatal deficiency when flying over the often unpredictable Pacific. Their combat tactics were often learned from outdated manuals rather than from seasoned instructors, as the experienced veterans who could have taught them were almost all dead, killed in the brutal campaigns over the Solomons, New Guinea, or the Philippines. The navigational challenge alone served as a brutal separator of the capable from the doomed, the living from the soon-to-be dead. The very act of flying a single-engine fighter on a 1,500-mile round trip over a vast, featureless ocean with only the most rudimentary of navigational aids required a level of skill, confidence, and trust in both one's machine and the support systems behind it that was almost unimaginable to the Japanese. American pilots embarked on these grueling missions armed with detailed and remarkably accurate weather briefings, compiled from a network of sources, including weather reports from submarines stationed along their route and dedicated reconnaissance flights. Their maps were constantly updated with the latest intelligence from photo reconnaissance missions, and their cockpit instruments were high-quality, reliable devices manufactured to precise specifications. Crucially, they flew with the psychological security of knowing that an elaborate safety net was in place for them. Rescue submarines of the Lifeguard League were strategically positioned along the flight path, their crews scanning the skies, ready to vector and search aircraft. These submarines saved the lives of dozens of downed airmen who would have otherwise perished in the cold Pacific. Long-range PBY, Dumbo, Catalina flying boats were also on standby, ready to land in the open ocean to pluck survivors from their life rafts. Japanese pilots, in increasingly stark contrast, flew into a void. Their maps were often outdated, failing to show recent bomb damage or newly established anti-aircraft positions. Their compasses were frequently unreliable, having not been properly swung or calibrated. And if they were forced down over water, there was virtually no hope of rescue. Their life rafts, if they were even issued one, often leaked, and their emergency rations had, in many cases, been consumed during the severe food shortages on the ground. A fortunate quirk of geography did provide the American pilots with a small but significant advantage. The magnetic variation between Iwo Jima and Tokyo was a mere 3 degrees west. This, combined with their respective positions on the lines of longitude, meant that for the return flight, A pilot who was lost or disoriented after a chaotic dogfight, his compass spinning wildly, could simply hold a basic south-southeasterly heading and know that if his fuel held out, he would eventually see the unmistakable silhouette of Iwo Jima's Mount Suribachi rising from the ocean. This simple geographic coincidence undoubtedly saved many American lives. The logistics supporting each force revealed the true, underlying nature of the Pacific Air War. It was not a contest of warrior spirit, but a brutal, mathematical contest between American industrial abundance and Japanese crippling scarcity. Every single VLR mission from Iwo Jima, involving nearly 100 Mustangs, consumed a staggering 57,000 gallons of high-octane aviation gasoline and expended over 230,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, not to mention the bombs and rockets carried for ground attack missions. This represented just one day's operations from just one of the 3 fighter groups operating from Iwo Jima. Behind this single day's expenditure stood a colossal logistical supply chain that stretched back thousands of miles to the factories of Detroit, the oil refineries of Texas, and the ammunition plants of Missouri. This river of supply was connected by a fleet of Liberty ships, which at the peak of the war were being produced at the astonishing rate of 3 per day, and a constant stream of C-54 Skymaster transport aircraft that flew regular cargo routes across the vast Pacific. Ships arrived at Iwo Jima daily, their holds filled with fuel, ammunition, spare parts, fresh food, mail from home, and 1,000 other mundane but essential items needed to keep a modern Air Force operational at the tip of the spear. Meanwhile, Japanese logistics had completely collapsed into a state of chaotic, hand-to-mouth desperation. Aviation fuel became so scarce that all non-essential training flights were canceled, forcing new pilots to face their first combat with no recent flying experience. Ammunition was so severely rationed that pilots were explicitly ordered to conserve their rounds for only the most certain of kill shots. The Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces, which had never coordinated well even in the best of times, now competed desperately for the dwindling pool of resources like starving dogs fighting over scraps of meat. Entire fighter groups were grounded for the want of basic items like tires, spark plugs, or hydraulic fluid. Aircraft were ruthlessly cannibalized for spare parts until they were nothing more than hollowed-out aluminum skeletons, and some desperate units even attempted to manufacture their own spare parts in primitive workshops, with predictably poor and often fatal results. This technological and logistical sophistication gap extended far beyond the aircraft themselves and permeated every single aspect of air operations. American pilots wore pneumatic G-suits that automatically inflated to squeeze their legs and abdomen, preventing the blood from rushing to their feet and causing them to black out in high-G maneuvers. They used standardized, highly reliable oxygen systems with automatic flow regulators that functioned flawlessly above 30,000 feet. They communicated with crystal clarity over multi-channel VHF radios that were a world away from the static-filled, unreliable sets used by their opponents. Their parachutes were regularly inspected and repacked by dedicated specialists. Their life rafts contained working emergency radios, fresh water, and medical supplies. Their survival kits were a marvel of miniaturization, containing everything from morphine syrettes to fishing gear. Japanese pilots, in contrast, often flew without functioning radios. Their vacuum tube sets were heavy, consumed precious battery power, and rarely worked properly anyway. They relied on unreliable oxygen systems that frequently failed above 20,000 feet, leading to insidious hypoxia, disorientation, and fatal errors in judgment. And they had no G-suits, which severely limited their ability to match the aggressive, high-G maneuvering of the American pilots without blacking out or suffering painful broken blood vessels in their eyes. Even for the technologically superior Americans, however, these extreme long-range missions pushed both men and machines to their absolute limits, and sometimes beyond. The greatest threat was often not enemy action, but the treacherous and unpredictable Pacific weather. This was brutally demonstrated on June 1, 1945, a day grimly remembered by the Mustang men as Black Friday. On a massive escort mission to industrial targets in Osaka, a force of approximately 150 Mustangs flew directly into a monstrous, unforecasted weather front of unimaginable violence. 27 aircraft were lost within minutes, with 24 of those losses attributed directly to the weather. Pilots became utterly disoriented in the towering, churning cumulonimbus clouds, flying into each other in the zero visibility conditions, or simply running out of fuel while desperately trying to find a way out of the storm's grip. The weather front extended from sea level to over 40,000 feet, a solid wall of violent turbulence, severe icing conditions, and zero visibility. Pilots reported eerie St. Elmo's fire dancing on their wings and canopies, their compasses spinning uselessly, and their artificial horizons tumbling as their gyroscopes gave up trying to make sense of the violent, chaotic motion. This disaster was a stark and humbling illustration that even for the best-equipped and best-trained Air Force in the world, the VLR missions were a perilous undertaking. The impact of the relentless Mustang raids on Japanese morale was catastrophic and irreversible. Captain Yoshio Yoshida, a key 84 pilot with the 47th Sentai who miraculously survived the war, wrote with stark clarity in his diary, "The appearance of American fighters over Tokyo has shattered our confidence completely. We were told the B-29s were vulnerable without their escort, that their fighters could never reach so far. Now we see Mustangs over the Imperial Palace itself, strafing our airfields in broad daylight, shooting down our best pilots as if they were beginners. How can we possibly defend the Emperor when the enemy's fighters roam freely, at will, over the sacred homeland?" The sight of those Mustangs with their bold invasion stripes, so confident, so numerous, tells us the truth that our leaders will not. The war is lost, and we are simply waiting to die. The physical and mental strain on the American pilots was also enormous and cumulative. As Major Tapp recalled in a post-war interview, battling Japanese fighter pilots caused your adrenaline to flow, but just getting from point A to point B and back again was the hardest part. The ocean was endless, featureless, hypnotic. You check your compass constantly, wondering if it was wrong, if you'd somehow gotten turned around. The pilots were strapped into their cramped cockpits for 8 hours or more, unable to stand, stretch, or properly relieve themselves except into a primitive relief tube that often froze solid at high altitude. They dealt with agonizingly cramping legs that felt like they were being stabbed with needles, numb buttocks that made them wonder if they would ever walk again, and the constant, gnawing anxiety of flying a single-engine aircraft over vast stretches of empty ocean, where a single mechanical failure meant almost certain death. In this grueling environment, even small details of design made a life-or-death difference. The Mustang's cockpit ergonomics, refined through 3 years of combat experience and thousands of pilot reports, were vastly superior to Japanese designs. The P-51D's revolutionary bubble canopy provided a completely unobstructed 360-degree view, allowing a pilot to simply turn his head to check his six, a life-saving capability in a dogfight. The seat and rudder pedals were fully adjustable to accommodate pilots of different sizes, and the controls were logically positioned to minimize pilot fatigue on long missions. The Ki-84's cockpit, while an improvement over earlier Japanese fighters, still suffered from poor visibility to the rear, awkwardly placed controls, and instruments that were difficult to read under the stress of combat. The differences in armament also proved to be decisive. While the Ki-84's cannons packed a heavier punch per shell, the P-51D's 6.50 caliber machine guns were extraordinarily reliable and carried a far greater ammunition load, 1,880 rounds compared to the Ki-84's total of 400. This meant that American pilots could afford to take ranging shots, engage multiple targets, and did not have to worry about running out of ammunition after a few short bursts. Furthermore, the ballistics of the .50 caliber round were so well understood that American pilots could reliably hit targets at ranges of 400 yards or more. Japanese pilots, struggling with the different trajectories of their mixed cannon and machine gun armament, found accurate shooting beyond close range to be nearly impossible. This was compounded by the vast disparity in gunnery training. American pilots had fired thousands of rounds in practice, learning deflection shooting until it became instinctive. Japanese pilots in 1945 were lucky to fire 100 rounds in training, if that. Many went into their first combat having never fired their guns at an aerial target at all, a fatal disadvantage. By August of 1945, organized Japanese air resistance over the home islands had effectively ceased to exist. On August 10th, the Sunsetters engaged in their last major aerial combat near Tokyo, claiming 7 more kills. But by this point, the opposition was almost token. Crippling fuel shortages meant that most Japanese fighters were grounded, their tanks drained to provide fuel for the last-ditch kamikaze aircraft. The pilots who did manage to get airborne were often teenagers with minimal training, boys who had been in high school just months before. In total, between April and August 1945, the Mustangs based on Iwo Jima were officially credited with 206 Japanese airplanes shot down, accounting for 75% of all Pacific P-51 aerial victories. The actual number was likely much higher, as many Japanese aircraft shot down over the dense forests or urban areas of Japan were never officially confirmed. The strategic impact of these victories extended far beyond the simple mathematics of aerial combat. The presence of P-51s over Japan meant that the B-29s could bomb with impunity in daylight, systematically and accurately destroying Japan's industrial infrastructure and grinding its war production to a complete halt. The psychological effect was equally devastating. Japanese civilians could now see American fighters strafing their airfields in broad daylight, shooting up trains, and attacking shipping in Tokyo Bay, making it brutally clear that their government had lost control of its own airspace. The myth of the divine wind that was supposed to protect Japan was shattered forever when American fighters flew brazenly over the Imperial Palace itself. Photo reconnaissance missions flown by specially modified P-51s revealed the true extent of the collapse. Airfields that intelligence reports said should have hundreds of aircraft were found to have only a dozen flyable planes, the rest being derelict hulks, some of them crudely fashioned wooden decoys. The industrial mathematics of the war were stark, irrefutable, and told the entire story in stark numbers. The United States produced 15,586 P-51s of all variants, more than Japan's total production of all aircraft types in 1944 and 1945 combined. At its peak, North American aviation alone was producing 20 P-51s per day, more than the number of Ki-84s Japan could produce in a month. Each American aircraft was essentially identical, with interchangeable parts, while Japanese aircraft varied wildly in quality and performance. The training pipeline told a similar story of overwhelming American advantage. By 1945, the United States was training 30,000 pilots annually, each receiving hundreds of hours of instruction. Japan's pilot training program had essentially collapsed. The mathematics of attrition were inexorable. America could replace its losses while maintaining quality. Japan could not replace its losses even with dramatically reduced standards. The final, brutal calculus of the air war was written in aluminum and blood across the skies of Japan. The P-51D Mustang, with its 440 miles per hour top speed, its 2,000-mile range with drop tanks, and its 6 reliable machine guns with nearly 2,000 rounds of ammunition, had rendered the Japanese home islands completely defenseless against daylight air attack. The Ki-84 Hate, despite the theoretical capabilities of the design and the immense courage of its pilots, never had the numbers, the reliability, or the pilot quality to mount an effective defense. It was not a contest between equals, but a foregone conclusion, the result having been determined in the factories of Detroit and by the oil wells of Texas, as much as by the combat over Tokyo. The American industrial might, perfectly expressed through the magnificent P-51 Mustang, had achieved what naval blockade and island hopping alone could not: the complete and utter elimination of Japan's ability to defend its own airspace. The B-29s that dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki flew without fighter escort, not because none was available, but because simply none was needed. Japanese fighter opposition had been swept from the skies, crushed by the overwhelming, irresistible superiority of American technology, training, and production. Out of the 3,514 Ki-84s that were built, only one survives today. It sits in the Chiran Peace Museum in Kagoshima, Japan, a solitary, poignant reminder of Japan's desperate and ultimately futile attempt to match American technological superiority. Meanwhile, hundreds of P-51 Mustangs survive in museums and private collections worldwide, many still flying at air shows, their magnificent Merlin engines singing the song of American industrial triumph 7 decades after they first appeared in the skies over Tokyo. The stark disparity in the number of surviving aircraft tells its own powerful and final story. The profound shock experienced by the Japanese pilots who first encountered Mustangs over Tokyo was more than just tactical surprise. It was a stunning, soul-crushing realization that American industrial capacity and relentless technological advancement had made the utterly impossible a daily, brutal routine. The P-51D Mustang soaring over Mount Fuji was not just an aircraft. It was the beautiful, terrible embodiment of American industrial supremacy, unceasing technological innovation, and the cold, inexorable mathematics of total war. The lesson was clear, brutal, and final. In the crucible of modern industrial warfare, superior technology, when multiplied by the awesome power of massive production, equals inevitable and absolute victory. The Japanese pilots who faced them in those final, terrible months learned the hardest and most unforgiving lesson of modern warfare. That courage and the warrior spirit, however profound, cannot overcome the cold, unyielding mathematics of industrial production, technological advancement, and logistical supremacy. The P-51D Mustang over Tokyo was the final, irrefutable proof that the age of the samurai had ended, definitively replaced by the age of the production line, the supercharger, and a very long-range fighter escort. The divine wind had been conquered by science. The warrior spirit had been broken by industrial might, and the empire of the rising sun had been irrevocably overshadowed by wings of aluminum and engines of steel.